Every town hides a story that refuses to fade. In the winter of 1992, high in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, the town of Silverton carried one such secret. A woman named Patricia Keller vanished without a sound, leaving behind a trail that led nowhere. She was a woman of precision, a creature of routine who never missed a single workday in 11 years. Yet on that bitter Wednesday morning, her chair at the county records office sat empty for the first time. Her front door was unlocked. Her winter coat still hung on the hook. Her boots waited by the door untouched. And in the snow behind her home, there was only one thing that did not belong. A single set of footprints that walked 15 feet into the yard and then simply stopped. What happened to Patricia Keller on that freezing January morning? And how could a woman walk into her backyard and vanish without leaving another trace behind? If you wish to uncover the truth buried beneath 26 years of silence, then like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Make sure to turn on the bell icon so you do not miss the next episode of this cold case series. Tell us in the comments from which city you are watching this story, and let us complete 5,000 likes to bring more unsolved mysteries back to light. It should have been an ordinary Wednesday morning. Patricia Keller was expected to arrive at the county records office at 7:30 sharp, just as she had every Wednesday for more than a decade. In Silverton, a town so small that everyone knew when everyone else came and went, her absence was impossible to overlook. By 8 o'clock, her supervisor, Margaret Walsh, felt the first tight pull of unease deep in her stomach. By 8:30, as the office phones began ringing with residents requesting birth certificates and property deeds, Margaret started dialing Patricia's number. The line rang 14 times before she hung up and tried again. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, wrong in a way she could not yet describe. It felt like the moment before an avalanche, when even the mountain holds its breath. Patricia Keller was 43 that winter. Though widow for 7 years, she had built her life around the strict order of familiar habits. Coffee at 6:15, shower at 6:30, out the door by 7:10 for the 12-minute walk to the courthouse. Her house on Mineral Street was modest and neat, painted a pale yellow with white trim, fenced by a chain-link barrier she had installed herself the previous summer. She kept her brown hair short and wore the same 3 cardigans in steady rotation. Nothing about her life suggested chaos or mystery. In Silverton, she was known for her steadiness, a woman as predictable as sunrise. When Margaret finally gave in to the dread curling in her chest and drove to Patricia's house during her lunch break, the January air was bitter, barely 8 degrees. The sky hung low and grey, heavy with unfallen snow. The yellow house looked still, almost peaceful, icicles hanging from the roof like crystal teeth. Margaret knocked hard enough to make her knuckles ache. When there was no answer, she tried the door. It opened easily. Inside, the home was so clean it could have been waiting for a photograph. The coffee mug sat washed and upturned on the dish rack. The bed was made with perfect hospital corners. The faint scent of lavender soap lingered in the air, yet Patricia's winter coat still hung on the wall hook. Her boots sat on the mat, crusted with salt from yesterday's walk home. Her purse rested untouched on the dresser, the wallet still inside. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing broken, and nothing out of place except for one fact. Patricia Keller was gone. Margaret stood there in the quiet kitchen, her breath trembling, surrounded by the evidence of a life paused mid-sentence. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. Then something inside her shifted, a deep instinctive certainty that this was not a misunderstanding or a delay. Something terrible had happened. By the time Chief Douglas Thompson arrived at the small yellow house on Mineral Street, the afternoon light had already begun to fade behind the San Juan peaks. The air was so cold that each breath felt like glass in the lungs. He stepped out of his patrol car, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and for a moment he simply looked at the house. It looked peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of quiet that hides something wrong. Inside, the warmth of the home felt strange, almost artificial against the icy air outside. The first thing he noticed was the stillness. Patricia's purse rested neatly on her dresser, her wallet inside with the bills untouched. Her car keys hung on a small hook beside the kitchen door. On the coat rack, Her winter jacket waited exactly where she had left it, and her boots sat on the floor below, crusted with salt from the previous day's walk home. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no drawers left open in a hurry. It was as if Patricia had vanished between one ordinary heartbeat and the next. Chief Thompson walked through each room slowly, his gloved hand brushing the back of the dining chair, the edge of the counter, the frame of the back door. Everything was clean, almost too clean. Then he noticed something that made him pause. The back door that opened toward the alley was unlocked. In Silverton, most people still trusted their neighbors, but in a missing person case, an unlocked door carried a different weight. He crouched to inspect the frame. The hinges were steady. The lock was unbroken. There was no damage at all. It looked as if the door had simply been opened by the person who lived there, or by someone she trusted. He pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and immediate. The snow in the backyard was fresh and untouched, except for one clear path. A line of footprints led away from the house, bare feet. The prints were small and narrow, walking in a straight line through 4 inches of snow. They crossed about 15 feet of ground and then stopped halfway to the fence. There were no returning steps, no drag marks, no sign of struggle, nothing to show that anyone else had been there. Just those footprints ending in the middle of the yard, as though Patricia Keller had walked out into the freezing air and simply disappeared. For a long moment, Douglas stood there staring at that final print. The edges of the track were sharp, frozen solid, untouched by wind. He took out his camera and photographed every step, every angle, knowing deep down that he was looking at something that defied explanation. By late afternoon, the story had already moved through Silverton, faster than the cold wind that swept through its narrow streets. The woman everyone knew, the one who processed their birth certificates and land deeds, had vanished. Neighbors called each other from frosted kitchen phones. The post office buzzed with whispers. By 4 o'clock, the entire town knew that Patricia Keller was missing. Chief Thompson gathered volunteers at the courthouse parking lot before sunset. 37 people arrived, bundled in heavy coats and wool hats, their faces pale with worry. Some carried lanterns, others flashlights, and a few had brought dogs trained for tracking. They formed groups of 4, each assigned to search a specific area around Patricia's neighborhood. The goal was to cover every possible trail before the night swallowed the light completely. They searched the streets, the alleyways, and the frozen creek beds. They combed through the woods where the pines stood dark and silent, their branches heavy with snow. They called Patricia's name again and again, their voices echoing through the cold air, but there was never an answer. One team thought they found a scarf buried under snow near the schoolyard, but it belonged to someone else. Another team followed tracks near the edge of town, only to discover they led to a fox's den. The hours slipped away. The temperature dropped below 0. By 10 that night, exhaustion and frostbite began to set in. Thompson stood in the courthouse lot once more, his flashlight beam flickering in the wind. Around him, volunteers returned one by one, their faces drawn, their movements heavy. He knew what they were all thinking, but would not say aloud. The longer Patricia Keller stayed missing, the smaller the chance of finding her alive. He looked toward the snow-covered hills and quietly called off the search for the night. The volunteers dispersed slowly, headlights cutting through the dark, leaving behind only silence and the faint hum of the wind through the mountains. Margaret Walsh was the last to leave. She stood for a moment by her car, staring toward the direction of Patricia's house, and whispered her friend's name to the cold air. Somewhere out there, a question waited without an answer. What could make a woman step barefoot into a frozen night and vanish without leaving a single trace behind? When the volunteers went home and the searchlights went dark, Chief Douglas Thompson remained behind. The cold had settled into his bones, but his mind refused to rest. Inside Patricia Keller's quiet kitchen, the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Officer Frank Hamilton sat across from him at the table, a young man of 28 who still believed every mystery could be solved with enough logic and determination. Between them lay a notepad filled with scribbled observations, sketches of footprints, and the kind of questions that had no reasonable answers. The two men sat in silence for a long time before Frank finally spoke. He kept circling back to those footprints in the snow. They were bare. The steps were neat and evenly spaced. The depth of each print matched perfectly, showing that whoever made them had been walking calmly, not running, not stumbling. There were no drag marks, no signs of panic. The trail went straight from the back door to the middle of the yard, and then simply ended. It was not possible. People did not vanish into open air, yet that was exactly what the prints seemed to show. Douglas rubbed his temples and tried to reason through it. Maybe someone had carried Patricia away from that last footprint. But if that were true, there would have been heavier impressions in the snow where the carrier had stepped, or drag marks, or at least disturbed snow around the spot. There was nothing. Could she have been lifted into a vehicle? No, the alley was too narrow for any truck to reach the yard, and there were no tire marks anywhere near the fence. Could she have climbed it? The fence was 6 feet high, and the snow beyond was smooth and untouched. No footprints on the other side. No sign of escape. Frank leaned forward, his voice low, asking if it was possible she had wandered off in a confused state, maybe barefoot from sleepwalking or a breakdown. But even that theory fell apart under the weight of the facts. Patricia Keller had been one of the most disciplined women in Silverton, someone who lived by the clock. There was no sign of confusion or distress in her life. No notes, no unusual behavior, no reason to walk barefoot into the freezing dark. The two men sat surrounded by the soft hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the kitchen clock, and the faint whistle of the wind outside. Every noise seemed amplified by the silence that followed it. Patricia's coffee mug still sat drying on the rack. Her book waited on the nightstand upstairs, open to a page she would never finish. The house was a time capsule of normal life, frozen at the moment it stopped. As midnight approached, Douglas closed his notebook slowly. He had worked long enough to know when a case was beginning to twist out of reach. This one already felt like that. He glanced at the back door again, at the darkness beyond it, and an unease crept over him that he could not shake. The logical explanations had already run out. What remained was something he could not name. Outside, the snow had started to fall again, soft and relentless, erasing what little evidence they had. By morning, the footprints that had baffled everyone would be gone, covered by a new layer of white. And with them would go the last visible trace of Patricia Keller. Something about that final footprint would haunt Chief Thompson for years, as if it were not just an imprint in snow, but a mark left on the town itself. And soon, what they found in the basement of that yellow house would make the mystery even deeper. By the third morning after Patricia Keller vanished, Silverton no longer felt like the same quiet mountain town it had been only days before. The missing posters had not even been printed yet, but everyone already knew her name, her house, and the strange story of the footprints that went nowhere. When the Colorado Bureau of Investigation arrived, people watched from their porches, their breaths forming clouds in the frozen air. Whispering as the unmarked black sedan rolled down Mineral Street, two agents stepped out. Michael Stewart, a tall man with tired eyes who had seen more tragedy than he cared to count, and Rebecca Hamilton, younger, sharp and methodical. They carried a quiet authority that made the townspeople step back and hope these two strangers could solve what their local police could not. Chief Douglas Thompson greeted them on the porch of the yellow house. Snowflakes clung to his shoulders as he briefed them in a low voice. Then they entered the home that had become a riddle. Inside, the air felt still, like the house was holding its breath. The agents moved carefully from room to room, taking in every detail. They listened as Thompson explained what had already been done, then began their own examination from scratch. Stewart started with interviews, while Hamilton began documenting evidence with a small camera that clicked softly in the silence. Their first stop was the courthouse. Margaret Walsh sat behind her desk, her hands folded tightly together, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She told them everything she knew about Patricia. Her routines, her habits, how she kept her life in perfect order. She described Patricia as steady, reliable, and gentle, the kind of person who could not stay away from work unless something terrible had happened. The agents could see the grief in Margaret's face, the kind of grief that comes from losing someone twice, once to absence and again to uncertainty. From there they went house to house along Mineral Street. 6 homes stood within shouting distance of Patricia's. Each resident told the same story. The night had been silent. No screaming, no sounds of struggle, no suspicious cars or footsteps. The Andersons, an elderly couple across the street, said they had fallen asleep before midnight and heard nothing. The family next door had been away in Durango. Others had simply slept through a night that had felt ordinary. No one had seen a thing. When the interviews ended, Stewart and Hamilton turned their full attention back to the house. They treated it like a frozen crime scene from the start. Every surface was dusted. Every object was photographed. Fingerprints were collected from doorknobs, counters, light switches, and furniture. The smallest details were logged and bagged, labeled with care that bordered on reverence. As the agents worked, the house began to tell its silent story. Patricia's life had stopped mid-moment. Her toothbrush was still damp in the bathroom. A cup sat rinsed and turned upside down beside the sink. In her bedroom, an open library book waited on the nightstand. A bookmark pressed halfway through a chapter she would never finish. In the kitchen trash, a grocery receipt showed she had bought ingredients for dinners she never got to cook. Nothing spoke of a woman preparing to leave. Everything suggested she intended to return. Then, as the daylight faded, Stewart's flashlight beam caught something unusual in the basement. Behind the old furnace, half hidden by pipes and dust, was a small window. It was not large enough for comfort, just 2 feet wide, a vent-style opening meant for airflow rather than entry. But what made Stewart pause was the latch. It was open. He crouched, his knees brushing the cold concrete floor, and examined the frame. The paint was chipped but old. There were no scratches, no damage, nothing that suggested a break-in from the outside. He pushed the glass gently. It moved freely. Beyond it was a narrow window well, a pit barely large enough for a person to crawl through on their stomach. The snow outside had drifted against it, sealing it from view. Yet from the inside someone had unlatched it. Hamilton knelt beside him, her brow furrowing. Whoever opened it had known it was there. But how would anyone crawl through that space in total darkness, without disturbing the snow above? And even if they had, how could that explain Patricia stepping barefoot into her yard in the middle of a freezing night? There were no footprints leading to the window from the outside, only the single line that began at her back door and ended mid-snow. As the 2 agents stood in the cold stillness of that basement, the silence pressed heavier. The clues did not form a path. They formed a circle that led nowhere. Later that evening, Rebecca Hamilton studied the plaster casts of the footprints that had been made before the new snow buried them. She examined every curve and ridge under the harsh light of the police station. The impressions were clear. Size 7 bare feet, toes slightly spread, as though cold had numbed them. The stride length was even. The depth of the prints showed steady weight, not running, not stumbling. Each step was calm. The final print was no deeper than the rest. And then nothing, no drag. No fall, no struggle. Just one last mark in the snow before the earth swallowed the rest. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something stranger, something that defied logic. And as the agents looked at each other, they both knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened to Patricia Keller in that backyard was not done revealing its secrets. As the investigation stretched into its 2nd week, Silverton began to change. What had once been a quiet and trusting mountain town now felt uneasy. The streets were the same, the faces were the same, but the air had grown heavier. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion carried the sound of fear. In the cafes and grocery lines, people whispered theories as if saying them out loud might somehow make sense of the impossible. Some said Patricia Keller had suffered a mental break. That grief from losing her husband years earlier had finally caught up with her. Others believed she had walked away from her life, vanished on purpose into the wilderness to end her pain. A few whispered that she had gone out into the snow in a trance, confused or sleepwalking, and that the cold had taken her quietly before dawn. They spoke as though she had simply lost herself to the mountains, another name swallowed by the winter. But not everyone accepted those ideas. Margaret Walsh, who had worked beside Patricia for more than a decade, refused to let anyone turn her friend into a ghost story. She rejected every suggestion that Patricia had chosen to leave. She knew her routines, her careful habits, her quiet determination. Patricia was not the kind of woman who would walk barefoot into the cold and give up. Margaret defended her every chance she got, sometimes with anger, sometimes with tears, reminding anyone who would listen that Patricia had lived a life of purpose and order. While the town argued, the investigators continued their search for something that would bring them closer to truth. Agents Stewart and Hamilton combed through the Keller house again, this time with forensic kits brought up from Denver. They worked slowly, inch by inch. On the wooden frame of the basement window, Hamilton found several small fibers caught in the paint. Under the microscope, they were synthetic, the kind used in work gloves. A partial fingerprint was lifted from the handle of the back door. It was faint, smudged, but not Patricia's. It did not match anyone who had visited the house recently. Outside, soil samples from the window well revealed traces of motor oil and cigarette ash, though Patricia did not smoke, and she did not own a car. These fragments did not form a complete picture, but together they whispered the same possibility. Someone else had been there. Someone who had entered her home unseen. The agents gathered in the small police station that night, their evidence spread across the desk under the harsh fluorescent light. None of it fit neatly together. There was no clear story, no single thread to follow. Yet all of it pointed toward one idea that none of them wanted to speak aloud. This was no accident. Then, 9 days after Patricia disappeared, a man named Carl Wilson came forward. He worked as a snowplow operator, living just a few blocks from Patricia's house. He told investigators that in the early hours of that morning, around 3 o'clock, he had been awake, standing at his kitchen window with a glass of warm milk. Through the frost on the glass, he had seen a lone figure walking slowly down Mineral Street. The figure had moved with purpose, head bent against the cold, and disappeared toward the edge of town where the road met the tree line. He was not certain it was Patricia. He was not even certain it was a woman. But the image had stayed with him. When asked why he had waited so long to say anything, Carl looked down and said quietly that he had not thought it mattered, that he had not wanted to waste anyone's time. The investigators noted his statement, but without proof. It was only another question in a case already built on uncertainty. And as the days went on, Silverton began to turn inward. Neighbors who had once shared coffee now crossed the street to avoid one another. Suspicion grew like frost spreading across glass. People locked doors that had never needed locks before. Each person began to wonder if the person responsible for Patricia's disappearance was someone they had known all their lives. The town that had once moved in harmony was now cracking under the weight of doubt. And soon that doubt would find names to cling to. As days turned into weeks, Silverton's patience thinned. Fear had begun to harden into suspicion. People no longer spoke of Patricia Keller as simply missing. They spoke of someone being responsible. The town needed a face to blame. And soon 3 men found themselves under the heavy weight of rumor and police attention. The first was Kenneth Fraser, Patricia's former brother-in-law. Kenneth had never been close to her, but everyone remembered his temper and his drinking. He was seen near Patricia's house a week before she vanished, claiming later that he had only stopped to check on her after hearing she was alone. When the police questioned him, his hands shook as he spoke, the smell of alcohol still fresh on his breath. He allowed them to search his small apartment above the hardware store. They found nothing violent, nothing to connect him directly to Patricia's disappearance. But whispers grew fast in a small town. By nightfall, people were already saying Kenneth had something to hide. The second name came from inside the church. Father James Murphy, Silverton's long-serving priest, had been counseling Patricia privately for months. It was supposed to be grief therapy, helping her through loneliness and old wounds that never fully healed. But in the silence of a town desperate for answers, rumors twisted those meetings into something else. Some whispered that the priest had grown too close, that there had been arguments behind closed doors. There was no proof, but when questioned, Father Murphy struggled to give a solid alibi for the night Patricia vanished. He said he had been at the rectory writing his sermon alone. His word was all he had, and in a town losing faith, it was not enough. Then there was David Wilson, the neighbor who lived directly across the street. David had known Patricia for years. He was quiet, polite, and always willing to lend a hand. Just last summer, he had helped her repair a section of her fence. But when investigators spoke to him, something in his eyes unsettled them. His voice trembled as he answered each question, his concern for Patricia sounding almost too personal. When the agents searched his house, they found a shoebox tucked away in his closet. Inside were dozens of photographs from community events, parades, picnics, town gatherings, and in nearly every one, Patricia appeared somewhere in the background, sometimes smiling, sometimes unaware of the camera. It was not illegal, but it was enough to raise uneasy questions about how much attention he had paid to her life. Word of these discoveries spread quickly, and by the next morning, Silverton was divided. Some believed Kenneth's temper had finally crossed a line. Others whispered about the priest behind his back. Many could not stop staring at David Wilson when he passed them on the street. No one was arrested, but all three men were marked by gossip that followed them everywhere. In a town as small as Silverton, reputation was everything, and suspicion became a sentence all its own. The people who had once gathered together in prayer for Patricia now began to look at each other with doubt. Doors that had stayed open for years were locked at night. Neighbors who once shared sugar or firewood no longer spoke. The town that had been built on trust was slowly falling apart under the weight of fear. And as the case dragged on without answers, the cold silence of the mountains seemed to grow louder, waiting for something, anything, to break it. Something that would come years later, from a discovery no one had seen coming. Winter melted into spring, but Patricia Keller was still gone. The mountains thawed, the creeks began to run again, and yet not a single clue surfaced. The agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation packed their files, loaded their evidence boxes into the black sedan, and drove back to Denver. For Silverton, their departure felt like the end of hope. Chief Douglas Thompson stood in the doorway of the small police station, watching their taillights disappear, knowing deep down that the town's most haunting mystery had just slipped into silence. He kept Patricia's file on his desk long after everyone else had moved on. It sat there like a ghost, a stack of reports and photographs that refused to rest. Every few days he would open it again, read through his notes, and stare at the photo of Patricia smiling from her office chair. He wanted to believe there was something he had missed, some small thread still waiting to be pulled, but there was nothing left to search. The state widened its search beyond Silverton. Search dogs were brought in from Denver, trained to detect human scent through miles of wilderness. Helicopters scanned the frozen valleys with thermal cameras. Deputies climbed through old mine shafts and waded through icy creeks. Each new attempt ended the same way, empty-handed. It was as if Patricia Keller had been erased from the landscape, but one person refused to let her vanish from memory. Margaret Walsh made it her mission to keep Patricia's name alive. Every Monday morning, she called the police department to ask for updates. Every month she sent letters to local newspapers, reminding them that Patricia's story was still unfinished. She organized a fundraiser at the town hall and raised $12,000 for a reward fund. Then, with the community's help, she had a memorial bench built in front of the courthouse, the place where Patricia had worked for 11 years. The plaque on the bench carried her name, her birth year, and the year 1992. But there was no confirmed death, just two silent dates divided by a dash that said more than words ever could. People found it unsettling. Some stopped to sit there in quiet reflection. Others avoided it entirely, unable to face the reminder of how a woman could vanish without leaving a trace. When January came again, the town held a vigil. Candles flickered in the snow, and prayers were whispered into the wind. But the crowd was smaller now, the faces older. Time had begun to soften the edges of grief into something colder, resignation. Patricia was no longer spoken of as a friend or a neighbor. She was becoming a story parents told their children, a warning about walking alone at night, a name lowered into myth. By March of 1994, the case file was officially stamped with a code, CC 920847. It was now listed among the state's cold cases. Chief Thompson signed the paperwork with a heavy heart, his pen shaking slightly as he wrote her name one last time. That night, long after the station lights were turned off, he sat alone at his desk reading through the file once more. He closed his eyes and pictured those footprints in the snow, the ones that began at her back door and ended in the middle of the yard, and he knew he would never stop seeing them. Years would pass, the seasons would change, and still that image would haunt him. The perfect trail of steps leading to nothing, the quiet mark of a life that ended without an answer. But sometimes silence only sleeps for a while, and one day something buried deep in the past would begin to stir again. Time moved quietly in Silverton. Winters came and went, snow fell on the mountains, and people stopped checking the newspaper for updates that never came. Patricia Keller's name was still carved on the plaque outside the courthouse, but most days, no one stopped to read it anymore. 11 years of routine had been replaced by 20 years of forgetting. The yellow house on Mineral Street, once so full of routine and warmth, changed hands 3 times. The new owners painted it pale blue, almost as if they wanted to erase the memory of the woman who had once lived there. The chain-link fence she had built herself began to rust, leaning slightly under the weight of years. In 1998, the new family sealed the basement window that had once drawn so much attention, bricking it over to keep the cold out. They had no idea that it was the same window through which investigators had once searched for answers. Margaret Walsh grew older, but she never stopped thinking about Patricia. She continued working part-time at the county records office, sitting each morning beside the empty desk where Patricia used to work. Her hair turned white, her hands ached from arthritis, but her habits remained steady. Every January, she took the 8th day of the month off. She said nothing about why. She simply stayed home, looking through old photographs and remembering the friend who had never come back. The $12,000 reward fund she had built through bake sales and donation. Jazz was eventually absorbed quietly into the town budget. There were no more flyers to print, no new tips to chase. It was as if Patricia's story had faded into the background hum of small-town life. Chief Douglas Thompson retired in 2002. He and his wife left the mountains behind for the dry warmth of Arizona. He carried only a few things from his office: the photograph of Patricia, a copy of the original case file, and the haunting memory of those footprints that ended in the snow. He never spoke of the case again, but it stayed with him until the day he died. When he left, a new police chief took over, Sarah Mitchell, younger, determined, professional. She came from Grand Junction with modern training and no emotional connection to the case. The Keller file was one of dozens she inherited, stored neatly in the cold case cabinet. To her, Patricia was a name on faded paper, a mystery too old to solve but too strange to ignore. Meanwhile, Silverton itself was changing. The mining town that once struggled to survive became a tourist destination. New shops opened along Main Street, boutiques, cafes, an art gallery, even a hotel that charged more per night than old residents earned in a week. Young families and retirees from the cities moved in, drawn by the beauty of the mountains. But with the new faces came forgetfulness. The old stories began to fade. People still mentioned Patricia Keller sometimes, but now she was just a tale, a warning about small-town secrets, something that belonged to another time. The memorial bench in front of the courthouse weathered with the years. The wood turned gray, the brass plaque grew dull. Teenagers sat there on summer nights, drinking or laughing, unaware of whose name they leaned against. Strangers sometimes slept there during the warmer months, using it as shelter, without realizing it had once been built to honor a missing woman. As for the men once blamed for her disappearance, their stories quietly ended too. Kenneth Fraser's liver failed in 1996, years of drinking finally claiming his life. Father Murphy left Silverton in the fall of 1993 and settled in Montana, where he died of a heart attack in 2003. David Wilson moved to Colorado Springs, remarried, had 2 children, and never returned to the town that had nearly destroyed him. By 2010, Patricia Keller had become a name in history books and old newspaper archives. That year, a journalist from Denver published a long article about Colorado's unsolved disappearances. Patricia's case filled 3 paragraphs, a summary of the footprints, the rumors, the cold ending. The writer described Silverton as a place that had moved on, but the truth was different. Beneath the charm of the tourist cafes and the mountain views, there were still people who looked at the blue house on Mineral Street and felt a shiver. People who remembered a winter morning when a woman vanished without a sound, and far away, sealed in a state evidence locker, a scrap of fabric that no one had thought important was waiting, quiet, preserved, and carrying within it the secret that would one day wake the town again. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in April of 2018 when the phone rang inside Chief Sarah Mitchell's office. On the other end was Detective Ryan Campbell from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. His tone was calm but deliberate, the way detectives sound when they are about to change the meaning of a very old story. He asked if she remembered the Keller case from 1992. Mitchell looked up from her desk toward the cabinet of cold files stacked in the corner. The name Patricia Keller was printed in fading ink on the side of one of those folders. She told him she remembered. Campbell explained that the state had begun reopening decades-old cases using new forensic tools that had not existed in the early 90s. Patricia's file had been pulled from storage as part of the review. The lab had decided to re-examine the physical evidence collected 26 years ago. The fibers from the basement window frame, the cigarette ash from the window well, and a small scrap of dark fabric found snagged on Patricia's fence. It had once been dismissed as irrelevant, too ordinary to matter. But now, with new DNA methods, even that tiny piece of cloth could speak. When the lab tested it, they found something astonishing. Despite the decades that had passed, trace skin cells were still trapped within the fabric's weave. The team extracted the biological material, built a genetic profile, and uploaded it to CODIS, the national DNA database. Hours later, the system returned a result. It was not a direct match, but a familial one. The DNA on Patricia Keller's fence was closely related to a man named Brandon Thomas, a construction supervisor from Grand Junction who had been arrested in 2014 for domestic assault. The lab concluded that the sample likely belonged to a close male relative of his, possibly a father, brother, or uncle. Detective Campbell's next call was to the Grand Junction Police Department. Records confirmed that Brandon had an older brother named Gregory Thomas. Gregory had no criminal history. He had never been arrested, never questioned in any case. But what made the detective's pulse quicken was Gregory's work history. He had been employed by a small company called Mountain View Construction. In the early 90s, that company had taken jobs across southwest Colorado, including Silverton. Campbell and his forensic analyst Jessica Torres made the 3-hour drive through the mountain roads to Silverton, carrying printed reports, photos, and a sense that something long forgotten was finally about to surface. When they arrived, Mitchell led them into her office. Papers and records were spread across the desk as Campbell began to explain what they had found. Gregory Thomas had been 27 years old in 1992. He had worked for Mountain View Construction from late 1991 through early 1993. Tax records and archived invoices pulled from storage in Durango showed that he had been assigned to multiple renovation projects in Silverton. And then came the document that made Mitchell's stomach tighten, a signed invoice dated December 14th, 1991. It listed the client as Patricia Keller, 847 Mineral Street. The job description read, basement waterproofing and foundation sealing. Gregory Thomas had spent 3 full days working inside Patricia's home, specifically in the basement where that small unlatched window was located. He would have known the structure of the house, the layout of the rooms, and that the window opened to a hidden space behind the furnace. He would have seen Patricia's routines, known that she lived alone, and known how quiet her street became after dark. When the job ended, Patricia paid in cash. Her signature confirmed it, neat and careful. It was the last known record of her dealing with anyone before she vanished. After her disappearance, Gregory left Colorado abruptly. He moved to Nevada, then to Oregon, taking temporary jobs before settling in Portland under his own name. For more than 20 years, he lived quietly. No arrests, no trouble, just a normal life. But there was something that Portland detectives found unusual once they began surveillance. Every year on January 8th, the anniversary of Patricia's disappearance, Gregory called in sick or took the day off. He stayed home alone with the curtains drawn, never answering the door. Chief Mitchell felt the air in the room shift as Campbell laid the last photo on her desk, Gregory's current driver's license. The face staring back at her looked worn and tired, the kind of face that had carried something heavy for a very long time. She realized then that this man, who had been inches away from discovery all those years ago, had never even been questioned in 1992. The reason was as tragic as it was simple. The work order for Patricia Keller's house had gone missing from Mountain View Construction's files. Without that piece of paper, no one had ever known that Gregory Thomas had worked there. He had been invisible to the original investigators. Now, 26 years later, the trail had reappeared. And what followed would uncover not only the truth about Patricia Keller, but the buried guilt of others who had helped keep it hidden. Detective Ryan Campbell leaned back in his chair and looked across the desk at Chief Sarah Mitchell. The room had fallen quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the old radiator. He spoke carefully, as if every word carried the weight of 26 lost years. He explained how Gregory Thomas, the man whose name now tied everything together, had slipped entirely through the cracks in 1992, when the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had first taken over Patricia Keller's case. One of their early steps was to contact local businesses that might have worked in the area around her house. They had asked every contractor and repair company in the region to provide lists of recent job sites. Mountain View Construction, Gregory's employer at the time, had been among them. But the list that company gave to investigators had been incomplete. Several addresses were missing, including Patricia Keller's home on Mineral Street. Campbell showed Mitchell the archived communication from the original file. A handwritten note recorded that the owner of Mountain View Construction had seemed distracted and unorganized, promising to provide a full record later, but it was never followed up. Nobody double-checked the paperwork. No one thought to compare the company's list with its tax forms or invoice receipts. Back then, everything had been stored on paper, and every mistake was easy to lose beneath a stack of other files. That single clerical gap had changed everything. It meant that Gregory Thomas's name never appeared on any suspect list, never entered any police interview, never reached the attention of the agents who had walked through Patricia's house searching for answers. He had vanished from the investigation before it had even begun. As Campbell spoke, Mitchell felt a chill run through her. It was not just the realization of how easily one man had escaped justice, but how close they had been to catching him all along. One missing document, one unchecked record, had allowed him to walk free for more than 2 decades. The case that had haunted Silverton for 26 years had not been unsolvable. It had been overlooked. And the thought that Patricia Keller's name might have found justice back then, if someone had looked 1 inch deeper, was almost too heavy to bear. But the time for mistakes was over now. The truth was finally within reach, and soon the quiet man who had built a new life under a different sky would face the past he had buried. The morning rain in Portland came down steady and gray on May 8, 2018. The quiet neighborhood was still waking up when 4 unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down the narrow street and stopped outside a small single-story house with a sagging porch. Inside one of those vehicles sat Gregory Thomas, finishing the same routine he had followed for years. Coffee in a travel mug, lunchbox in hand, keys ready for another day of work at the landscaping company. He stepped out of his front door without noticing the officers until they surrounded him. The team of Portland Police and United States Marshals moved with quiet precision. One officer called his name. Another asked him to put his hands where they could see them. Gregory froze in the drizzle, looking older than his 53 years. shoulders slumped under a worn jacket. He did not resist. He did not argue. He simply raised his hands and stared at the ground. A witness later said that his face went through 3 expressions in slow motion: confusion, recognition, and something that looked very much like relief. As they cuffed him, he asked one question in a voice barely above a whisper: "Is this about Colorado?" The officers exchanged a look but said nothing. His question told them everything. 3 hours later, Chief Sarah Mitchell sat in her Silverton office as the call came through. Detective Campbell's voice carried a mix of exhaustion and triumph. After 26 years, they finally had him. The man who had worked in Patricia Keller's basement. The man who had walked away unnoticed was now in custody. Mitchell thanked him, then stared out the window for a long time before making the next call, the one she had been dreading. Margaret Walsh was 72 years old now, living in a quiet retirement community in Durango. She answered the phone with her usual soft voice. Mitchell told her what had happened slowly, carefully, explaining who Gregory Thomas was and how the evidence had led to him. There was a pause on the line long enough that Mitchell thought the call had disconnected. Then Margaret asked the only question that mattered to her. "Did he say where Patricia is?" Mitchell's throat tightened. She said no. Gregory Thomas had already asked for a lawyer. He had not spoken a word since the moment of his arrest. Margaret did not cry. She simply thanked the chief and hung up. For a few moments, Mitchell sat in silence, listening to the rain against the glass, thinking about how many people had carried this case like a weight across the decades. One man had been captured, but the most important answer, the one about where Patricia had gone that night, was still missing. And soon, the truth of how Gregory Thomas managed to hide for so long would come from voices no one expected to hear. After Gregory Thomas was taken into custody, the investigation widened. Detectives began examining every trace of his life, searching for what had allowed him to hide for so long. When they pulled his recent phone records, something unexpected appeared. Even after decades, Gregory had been in contact with 3 people who were all tied to Silverton in 1992. 3 names that connected him directly back to Patricia Keller's disappearance: Helen Bauer, Carl Anderson, and Richard Hoffman. Helen Bauer had once worked as the secretary for Mountain View Construction, the same company Gregory had been employed by during the time of Patricia's disappearance. When investigators reached her home in Colorado Springs, she broke down before they even began their questions. Her confession came out in fragments. On the morning after Patricia vanished, she said, Gregory had shown up at the office pale and shaking. He told her something terrible had happened and that he needed her help. He begged her to remove Patricia Keller's invoices and work orders from the company's files so that no one could connect him to the house on Mineral Street. She had done it. Out of fear, out of loyalty, or maybe out of shock. Helen said she had spent the rest of her life haunted by that moment, waking up at night, hearing the sound of Gregory's voice begging her to help him. For 26 years she carried the secret, too ashamed to come forward. Now facing the truth, she wept as she admitted to destroying the evidence that could have changed everything. The investigators charged her with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. She did not resist. She said it was more punishment than she ever expected to survive. Then there was Carl Anderson. He still lived in Silverton, in the same small house his parents had owned when Patricia disappeared. When the agents knocked on his door, he seemed to know why they were there. He told them he had been waiting for that day for a long time. In the weeks after Patricia vanished, Carl had been cleaning his parents' garage when he found a dark blue cardigan shoved behind a stack of paint cans. There were stains on the collar and sleeve that looked like blood. He had planned to take it straight to the police, but before he could, Gregory Thomas appeared at the house. Gregory told Carl that the cardigan had been found near Patricia's fence while he was working on another property, that it had nothing to do with her disappearance, and that turning it in would only cause confusion. He spoke calmly, almost kindly, and convinced Carl to hand it over. Carl never saw that cardigan again. For years he tried to bury the memory, but it ate at him. He admitted that his silence had destroyed his sleep, his health, and his peace of mind. Now gray-haired and trembling, He told the investigators everything. The third name on the list was the one that shocked them the most. Richard Hoffman, the former owner of Mountain View Construction. He was retired now, living comfortably in Arizona. When investigators confronted him, he hired a lawyer immediately, but eventually agreed to talk. His version of the story was colder, more calculated. In late January of 1992, Gregory had come to him in private and confessed that something had gone terribly wrong with Patricia Keller. Hoffman did not ask many questions. He only thought about his business and his reputation. Rather than turn Gregory in, he chose to protect himself. He gave him a few $1,000s in cash and a letter of reference under a slightly changed name, allowing Gregory to move to Las Vegas and start over. Hoffman admitted that he had done it out of fear that his company would be blamed for hiring someone involved in a possible crime. He had never reported it to police. For 26 years, he had lived with the knowledge that his choice had helped a killer vanish. As investigators gathered these statements, the picture grew clearer. Gregory Thomas had not escaped alone. He had been surrounded by silence, 3 people who had each played their part in hiding his crime. One through fear, one through persuasion, and one through greed. The town of Silverton had thought Patricia Keller's case was a mystery without clues. But now, the truth was beginning to unfold like a map that had been folded for too long. And what it revealed would shake the community one more time when the story finally reached a courtroom. In the summer of 2019, Silverton once again found itself at the center of attention, though no one wanted this kind of spotlight. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the town's courthouse, the same building where Patricia Keller had once worked, was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras flashed in the morning light, and satellite vans parked along the street. The trial of Gregory Thomas had begun. Gregory was extradited from Oregon and brought back to Colorado to stand before the San Juan County Courthouse. Inside, the air was thick with tension and memory. It was not just another trial. It was the return of a story that had haunted an entire generation. Every creak of the wooden benches echoed with years of waiting. Among those in the front row sat Margaret Walsh, now in her 70s, her hair silver and her hands clasped tightly around a worn handkerchief. She had promised herself she would see this to the end, no matter what it took. When Gregory entered the courtroom for the first time, escorted by deputies, he looked smaller than anyone had imagined. He did not glance toward the gallery, not even once. The defense immediately tried to have the trial moved to another county, arguing that Silverton was too emotionally tied to Patricia Keller's name for a fair hearing. But the judge denied the request. The case, he said, would be tried where it began, where the truth had first been buried. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline that had been rebuilt piece by piece after all these years. They described how Gregory Thomas had worked in Patricia's basement that December, how his fascination with her had grown into fixation, and how he had known every inch of her house, including the small unlatched window behind the furnace. They spoke of how Patricia had been alone that January night, how Gregory had returned, found how the cover-up had begun by morning. Witness after witness stepped forward, each one pulling another thread from the past. Gregory's former co-workers testified that during that winter job he often spoke of Patricia in ways that made others uncomfortable. Helen Bauer took the stand next. Her voice trembled as she confessed to destroying Patricia's invoices at Gregory's request, admitting that she had lived in her own private prison ever since. Then came Carl Anderson. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He told the jury about the dark blue cardigan he had found in his parents' garage, the stains that looked like blood, and how Gregory had talked him out of reporting it. When he finished, he broke down, sobbing that he wished he had been brave enough to speak sooner. Finally, Richard Hoffman was called. Unlike the others, he showed no emotion. His tone was flat, his words measured, as he described how Gregory had come to him after the disappearance, how he had given him cash and a reference letter, and how he had helped him disappear. He said it was not out of compassion, but out of fear of losing his company. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as he finished. Each testimony carried its own weight, Helen spoke of living in hell for 27 years. Carl wept for his silence. Hoffman stared straight ahead, detached, as if still trying to justify what he had done. The defense tried to push back. They argued that Gregory had lived peacefully for decades, that the DNA on the fence only proved he had once worked there, not that he had killed anyone. They said the memories of witnesses after so many years were unreliable, blurred by time and guilt. But the prosecution was ready. They presented the DNA evidence, the unique familial match that tied Gregory's bloodline directly to the sample found on Patricia's fence. They highlighted his strange ritual of taking every January 8th off work, a date only he seemed to honor. They reminded the jury of the destroyed invoices, the secret payments from Hoffman, and the cardigan that had vanished forever. Piece by piece, they built a story that could no longer be denied. After 6 days of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. Gregory Thomas was found guilty of second-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. The sound of the verdict echoed through the room like a closing door. Gregory sat still, eyes lowered, saying nothing. In the front row, Margaret Walsh finally let the tears fall. For 27 years she had held them back, telling herself she had to stay strong for Patricia. But now, as the judge read the sentence, she wept openly, the kind of tears that come not from victory, but from the exhaustion of finally knowing. And yet, even as the courtroom emptied, one truth remained unsettled. Gregory Thomas was in prison, but Patricia Keller's body had still never been found. And somewhere beneath the weight of all those years, that absence continued to whisper. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. The sound of paper rustling was the only movement in the air as the judge's voice carried across the room. Gregory Thomas was given 30 years to life in prison, plus 10 more years for the improper disposal of human remains. It was a sentence that meant he would never walk freely again. If parole ever came, he would be too old to see daylight as anything more than a faint memory. He stood there, head bowed, showing no reaction. The man who had hidden for half his life looked small beneath the weight of his own choices. The silence after the verdict stretched long, heavy, and final. Then the judge invited Margaret Walsh to speak. Slowly, she rose from her seat. Her steps were careful but steady as she approached the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew stronger with each word. She spoke not of hatred, but of loss. She told the court about Patricia's kindness, her discipline, and how she had rebuilt her life after losing her husband. She described how Patricia had never given up, how she had lived with quiet strength and purpose, and how the world had been colder without her in it. Her final words filled the courtroom with a kind of stillness that felt sacred. When the accomplices were sentenced, the weight of their decisions came due. Helen Bauer, frail and tearful, received a suspended sentence and probation for obstruction. The judge said she had already served her punishment in her own mind for 27 years. Carl Anderson was given community service and restitution, his youth and manipulation recognized as mitigating factors. He broke down again when he was released from the courtroom, whispering that he could finally breathe. Richard Hoffman, who had enabled Gregory's escape, received 18 months in a minimal security facility and was ordered to pay restitution into a new fund created in Patricia Keller's name. Silverton itself was not spared from the reckoning. The town that had once whispered rumors now had to face what it had done, how it had turned suspicion into silence, how it had allowed fear to grow instead of courage. The people who had avoided each other for years finally began to speak again, this time with honesty instead of gossip. The old memorial bench in front of the courthouse was restored. Its brass plaque was replaced with new words that read, "Justice delayed but not denied." Flowers appeared at its base for the first time in years, and every morning for a while, Margaret sat there quietly, watching the sun rise over the town she had fought to remind of the truth. 8 months later, she passed away in her sleep. She had lived long enough to see justice come, but not long enough to feel what peace might have followed. Gregory Thomas never revealed where Patricia's body was. Not during the trial, not during the appeals, not even when offered considerations for cooperation. He took that truth with him into the silence of his prison cell. Investigators came to accept one reconstruction of what had happened that night. Gregory had entered through the basement access he had personally sealed weeks earlier. He confronted Patricia in her home, perhaps in a burst of anger or obsession. He forced or lured her into the yard, barefoot in the freezing dark. The single line of footprints that ended mid-snow was her last trace, the final physical mark she ever left behind. Her body was moved from the property before dawn and hidden somewhere deep in the mountains, in a place only Gregory knew. Over time, the case became more than a story. It became a lesson. Police academies across Colorado used it as a teaching example, a warning about how small mistakes in an investigation can bury the truth for decades. Forensic scientists spoke of it as proof of how DNA could resurrect the dead, not in body, but in justice. And for the people of Silverton, it became a reminder of what silence can do to a town. The Keller house on Mineral Street still stands. Its blue paint has faded. Its windows look out over the same street that once filled with search parties and flashlights in the snow. Some say the house feels different when you walk by, colder somehow, as if it remembers everything that happened there. Justice finally came to Silverton, but it did not feel like relief. It felt like the closing of a book, whose ending no one wanted to read. Patricia Keller was gone. Margaret was gone. The town had changed forever. What remained was the echo of a life stolen too soon, and the people who refused to forget her. If you are still watching this story, it means this journey touched you. So this story truly deserves your like and subscribe, and make sure to turn on the bell icon so you never miss stories like this one. Please help me reach 5,000 likes on this story. My mother set this goal for you, and I hope you can make it happen. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story.